That's pretty loud, isn't it? Okay. So, hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to my class. Certainly, I'm very, very pleased to be here. Glad that you all made it. I have probably figured out by now I'm pretty passionate about, those of you who know me, I'm pretty passionate about this subject. I certainly have been studying it for a long time. But one of the cool things about doing this class is, as I research for my individual class, I learn a lot more things myself. So that's been kind of fun for me to be able to do that. So a couple things. If you have a question, I will be glad to answer the question. Please just raise your hand. And if I don't have an answer or I don't have a good answer, sometimes I think my answers are kind of lame, so we need to work on them. What we will do is we will start the next class with those questions that either I was unable to answer or didn't answer fully. So, with that, this class is basically designed for people from the U.S., and hopefully we'll give you some insight into some things that aren't necessarily common knowledge or a little different than what you might see watching the military channel. So, with that said, most of us think about the war in the Pacific as being Marines charging up a sandy beach, palm trees, and this is a lot of what we, I think, as U.S. citizens think about the war. War is basically the United States versus Japan. We think about the destruction of the Arizona at Pearl Harbor. Iconic picture, certainly brings, we've all seen this event, and it's very, very, it's kind of like our vision of the war. And then perhaps the biggest picture would be the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. The war, you know, that really brings, to American audience, I think that really brings the war home again. And it really kind of brings to the fact that the Marines must have had really good PR because they're constantly in our thoughts. So, and actually the Army had a lot more troops in the Pacific than the Marines did. But I think that's kind of what we think of as Americans of what went on in the war. But when we look at the war, we can see that in fact the Pacific was the largest single battlefield in history. From east to west, and I'm talking about major battles, I'm not talking about like a submarine popped up off the coast of the U.S. and, you know, fired a few shells. I'm talking about major battles from east to west, from Pearl Harbor all the way to India, in north to south from the Aleutian Islands, which are there, all the way down to Australia. So if we look at this in relationship to the globe, I don't know, maybe 20% of the Earth was actually involved in this conflict. And again, not just between the United States and Japan, but, you know, Britain was involved, obviously, in Burma and Malaysia. The Australians, Australia was bombed many times. India is in the war, Holland and Indonesia, which at that time was the Dutch East Indies. Burma, the Philippines, New Zealand, Russia is involved in the war at the very end. And France is there, and many, many others. So I think that the war is vastly more expansive than what we tend to see it as U.S. citizens. All right, so what is the point of the war for the Japanese? Well, they're trying to develop something called the Southern Resource Area. And Japan, being a relatively poor country as far as resources, and generally their economy wasn't that large, they decide that they need to have access to more and more natural resources, particularly after 1941 in July when they take over. They didn't invade necessarily French Indochina, but they take over French Indochina, and the United States and Britain and Malay and the Dutch do not ship them any more oil. We embargo all their oil, and 80% comes from the United States, 20% comes from basically the Dutch. So now they have no oil. So this puts a resource thing on them. They really want to get more natural resources. So what are they going to do is they're going to try to take over this area here. And obviously Brunei, you may be aware, is a major source of oil even today. And of course there's tin and rubber and a lot of things that they would really like to have. So they're also convinced that if they do this, that the United States is probably not going to just sit by idly and say, well, you know, I guess they took that from the British and the Dutch. We're not going to do much about it. And they really think this through and say, well, you know, maybe what we need to do is do something about the Philippines, because the Philippines would be would be able to cut off the sea route from the southern resource area. So they make a decision that not only should they attack the British and the Dutch, which may have been a better idea, but they decide to attack us as well because they assume we will not tolerate this land grab in effect. So I think they kind of missed out the fact that there was a lot of isolationist sentiment in the U.S. You may remember, or may not, but the ability to draft troops at this time only passed the House by one vote. So the United States was not necessarily wanting to get that involved into World War II in Europe or particularly in Asia. So it's questionable, but they made this decision anyway. Now they're going to live with it. So here's our picture of Prime Minister Tojo, the general. He is Japan is under military control basically at this time. Their prime minister is a general. Almost all their politicians are related to the military. So it's pretty much tied in that way. But what they want to do is they want to create this thing called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And they want to remove colonial powers, and they want Japan to be the head of Asia, and in kind of a paternal manner. It's not quite like the Nazis with, Lebensraum. It's more, they see themselves in more of a Confucian manner, that they would be, like I said, the head of the family, the father figure of Asian nations. They firmly believe that Russia and Great Britain will be defeated by Germany. So they think this is an opportunity. And they think because of that going on, the U.S. will be much too involved and will not be able to really intervene in Asia in any sort of great way. Also, they don't have a lot of respect for the United States as far as our will to fight. They intend to build a line of fortified islands. So what they're going to do is they're going to take over a bunch of little islands in the middle of the Pacific, and they're going to put air bases on these and make them unsinkable aircraft carriers. And then they're going to, whenever a threat comes, fly in military aircraft, primarily naval, to defend those bases and also to attack the U.S. fleet. So that's their goal, is to control the Pacific via air power, as well as their fleet. And then, in order to achieve this goal, they intend to attack the U.S. fleet in order to put it out of commission and make sure that they have time to build all these air bases and to take the natural resources of Southeast Asia to build their economies so they will become a world power. All right, the U.S. war aims are a little bit different. And Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State. He is not a big fan of Japan at all. But the U.S. goal is to try to avoid global conflict. They don't really want to get involved with this. We've got a lot on our plate trying to support Britain, and the Roosevelt administration is much more concerned about Germany. They're much more concerned about that. So we don't really want to fight at this point. The U.S. public, again, because of the isolationist sentiment, has a strong desire to stay out of the war. They don't really want to do this. But interestingly, since the Japanese attacked China in 1937, there's a significant sentiment that the Japanese are bad guys, the Chinese are good guys, and a lot of Americans want us to support China, not necessarily by getting into the war, but by supplying them with military aid for such people as the Flying Tigers that you may all be familiar with. So we're willing to give Japan and it does play into our goals too, because Japan basically will be occupied with dealing with China rather than trying to deal with us, which again buys us time. And that's what they're really looking for, is time. And the United States policy is the open door, where we basically say that all nations should be able to trade independently in China particularly. But also, the United States has got a little bit more benevolent appearance to Asian nations because we have agreed in 1946 to allow the Philippines to become an independent nation, unlike Britain and the Dutch, who have no intention whatsoever of allowing that to occur. But we actually have a little bit better PR in the area with the fact that we have granted independence to the Philippines in the future. And our minimum goal, the absolute minimum that we're trying to achieve, is to delay the Japanese from doing anything major offensive-wise in Asia, at least until spring of '42, because we are rapidly building up our forces in the Philippines as a deterrent to them. We are sending over bombers, we are sending over troops, tanks, and we've really changed our whole aspect of how we intend to run the war in the Pacific. It was originally we were not going to do this, so they have changed, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Philippines. Well, Britain, well, it's pretty obvious what they want. They want to keep their imperial possessions. You know, they want their colonies. They need their colonies to help fight the Germans. So they don't want to give up Hong Kong. They certainly don't want to give up Malaysia. They don't want to give up Burma. And Lord knows they don't want to give up the crown jewel of the British Empire, which is India. So they do anything they can to try to deter the Japanese from attacking in Southeast Asia. They don't want any part of this. They can't afford it. The Dutch, who their government is now in Britain because the Germans have control of Holland, they're hoping for the war to end and then go back to the status quo of them controlling Southeast Asia, in effect Indonesia. France is under the Vichy government because they've been defeated by the Germans, and they're basically still in control theoretically of Vietnam and parts of Cambodia, but the Japanese have occupied this, and so their government is still in place there. So the Japanese recognize that the French have control, and literally in 1945 the Japanese finally do overthrow the French government in Vietnam. Okay, with Australia, Australia is doing everything it can to help Britain. They've sent 3 divisions to North Africa, 3 very good divisions. They have nothing much more they can do. Australia is not a big economic or a power, but they are now forced really to look to the United States for their security in Asia, because the fact of the matter is Britain is so busy with the war in Europe. Okay. The first day of the war in Japan is December 8th, because they're across the date line. So December 8th is December 7th in Hawaii. And their plan for the first day of the war is incredibly ambitious. What they're going to do is they are going to invade Siam or Thailand. They are going to go to the Kra Isthmus and invade that. They are going to invade Hong Kong. They are going to invade the Philippines. They are going to invade Guam. They're going to invade Wake Island, and they're going to make a raid, a carrier attack on Pearl Harbor. That's all on the first day. That's pretty ambitious. I mean, hey, we're going to take over, you know, a good portion of the planet on day one. Well, they're not going to take it over, but they're at least going to attack it all on the first day of the war. So, let's talk about this guy, and let me give you a little thing for tomorrow. There will be a special presentation for Wisdom Wednesday on Yamamoto. It will be right here on this stage. I would highly recommend you see this. Unfortunately, I will not be able to attend because I would love to ask a lot of questions because I actually have the gentleman's book. So, let it be said that if you really like this aspect of the war, then I would strongly recommend you attend Wisdom Wednesday tomorrow. But I've got Isoroku Yamamoto up here, and notice I have the number 56. And you're probably going, well, was he 56 years old? No. Isoroku is kind of a colloquial term for the number 56. So basically, his name could be interpreted as being 56 Yamamoto. Now, why would that be? Well, the story goes that his father was 56 years old when he was conceived. So since Viagra had not yet been invented, obviously his father was relatively proud of this effect. So that's the story. All right, Admiral Yamamoto is the leading proponent of Japanese naval air power and is against joining the Axis. He has been educated in the United States. He is a naval attaché to Washington for the Japanese Navy. So he's very familiar with the United States and its potential economic and military power. He also is an inveterate gambler and loves to play poker. So this guy says, hey, you know, I don't know if this is such a great idea. And there's a lot of hotheads in the Japanese military, which we will probably not discuss in this class, but I will discuss in my other one. And they assassinate people on a regular basis. And to avoid assassination, he is shipped to the head of the combined fleet. So he's out on a ship so people can't kill him. All right? He thinks that the idea of the traditional battle fleet is obsolete. Not totally obsolete, but kind of obsolete. And he does not want to build the Yamato-class BB. BB, which you will see many times in this presentation, is the term for battleship. So he doesn't want to build these. And the idea of the Yamato class is they're so big. In fact, they're still the world's largest battleships. Nothing's ever been built larger. And the idea was they built a battleship so large that the United States wouldn't be able to build anything that would match it that could sail through the Panama Canal and would cause us to have two separate fleets. That was the thinking behind the Yamato class. It doesn't really work out that way, but that's what they thought. So he says, you know what we need to do is we need to attack Pearl Harbor. And the head of the Japanese, not the head of the Japanese Navy, he's the head of the Japanese fleet. The heads of the Japanese Navy go, well, you know, I don't think that's a very good idea, you know. And he says, well, you know what? If you don't let me do that, I'm going to resign. And unlike U.S. policy, where I'm sure that the head of the U.S. Navy would have said, okay, see you later, the Japanese say, oh, okay, fine, we'll let you attack Pearl Harbor. So there's a few quotes for him. I will run wild for the first 6 months to a year. After that, I have no confidence. So he tells the Japanese government straight out, he's not real confident about this whole thing. Then there's two other quotes that are very famous that are attributed to him. One is the sleeping giant quote, where he says, theoretically, well, by attacking the United States, we've awoken a sleeping giant. There's absolutely no proof that he ever said that. So that one, I think, is a little bit more Hollywood than it is actual. The other one that is attributed to him is that if the Japanese expect to have peace with the United States, it will have to be signed on the steps of the White House. He probably did say that, but he didn't mean that the Japanese would invade the United States and capture the White House and sign peace there. What he was doing was he was warning the Japanese military government that the U.S. isn't going to probably surrender the way you think they are. So the fact of the matter is, after 6 months to a year, we better figure out a way how to have a peace conference, because we're not going to win this war if it goes on much longer. So 2 big changes there for Yamamoto. All right, so a key to the Japanese plan to attack Pearl Harbor is a thing called Kido Butai, which is Mobile Strike Force, or Strike Force. And Mobile Strike Force consists of 6 large aircraft carriers, or the proper term would be 6 fleet aircraft carriers. Again, this is totally different. No one else in the world is doing this at this time. No one has taken the thought process to take a large fleet of aircraft carriers, put them together, teach the troops or teach the pilots, etc., how to act as a unit. So basically, they can put massive amounts of aircraft into the air in rapid fashion, controlled by one pilot that flies along with them from one of the multiple aircraft carriers. This is a huge departure from how anybody else in the world fights. Because what normal Western navies do is they put one aircraft carrier with the battle fleet. The aircraft carrier is designed to be the eyes of the fleet, and perhaps also to do some damage to an enemy warship so the fleet can catch up with it and destroy it. And that's graphically demonstrated by the hunt for the Bismarck. A single swordfish torpedo damages the rudder of the Bismarck, and then the British Navy sails up with all its battleships and pummels the Bismarck to death. Okay? So that's how most other fleets, in fact, that's how all other fleets intended to use aircraft carriers. The Japanese, vastly different. They're going to use aircraft carriers as a strike force. So this thing works out really well. In fact, it is the single best weapon system that the Japanese ever come up with. And indeed, Kido Butai will run wild for 6 months. All right, let's talk about some of the aspects of Kido Butai. One of those is the Kate torpedo bomber. And the Kate torpedo bomber can function in 2 ways. It can drop a torpedo from low level, or the Kate also can be used as a level bomber to fly over a target and drop a bomb using a bomb sight. 2 of those types are, of course, the torpedo itself and this dainty little bomb it's carrying there, which is actually made out of a shell from the battleship Nagato and weighs 1,760 pounds. So it is a very, very large bomb for a carrier aircraft to be carrying at this time. Our largest bomb for a carrier aircraft at this time was 1,000 pounds. But they have developed this. And the other thing interesting with this aircraft, it only has a 1,000 horsepower engine. So it really doesn't have a very powerful engine. But it can fly really fast. It's got really long range. But there's, like any engineering project, it has some faults. And the fault is that the aircraft does not have self-sealing fuel tanks, which A, add weight, and B, reduce the total amount of fuel you can carry. And B, it does not have any pilot armor or any armor whatsoever. So consequently, it's kind of a death trap when it's attacked. And it's a highly effective weapon. These crews are all combat veterans because they've been fighting in China since 1937, and they're really, really motivated. Okay, let's talk about the Japanese torpedoes that were used at Pearl Harbor. Those of you that are Pearl Harbor aficionados may be aware that Pearl Harbor is very shallow. It is not a deep harbor. Consequently, it's approximately at parts, it's about 40 feet deep. When you drop a torpedo from an airplane, that torpedo will go down underwater approximately 100 to 150 feet deep, depending on how high and how fast you drop it. Consequently, torpedoes would be completely unusable in Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese have to find a way for that to be overcome. And what they do, and their torpedoes are pretty advanced. Let's just talk about that real fast. Their torpedoes are gyroscopically stabilized. And they're gyroscopically stabilized by two little fins that you can see here, okay? So if you drop a torpedo and it falls off the airplane and it tilts a little bit, let's say it falls a little bit off to its side, right? If you put the rudder to raise it up, well, it's not going to raise it up, it's going to turn it. And the way normal torpedoes are functioned is they put more weight on the bottom of the torpedo, so hopefully it lands flat and then can rise back up to the surface and hit the ship that it's aimed at. Torpedoes in this era are not self-controlled. They don't have homing devices or anything like that. You drop it, they go in a straight line, hopefully. So the Japanese have come up with a pretty advanced system here with this gyroscopic roll control. It allows the torpedo to right itself quickly and go more on line. All right? What they do at Pearl Harbor is they think that, you know what? They think that we could put some fins, some wooden fins on those anti-roll devices, and when the torpedo drops out of the air, those will actually act like something in the air to keep the torpedo level. So as soon as that torpedo hits the water, you can immediately push that rudder up and bring it up. Now, they had some other thoughts on this about trying to do this. They worked on this for months. They were thinking even of having their Kates, the torpedo bombers, fly super low, super slow, drop the landing gear so they would even be slower, and try to drop these torpedoes as softly as possible. That wasn't working out. So they came up with this idea. And they brought in 3 crews. They had 3 of these torpedoes to test. They brought in a really top-notch crew that could really drop a torpedo well. They dropped in a kind of a middle-of-the-road torpedo crew, and they brought in a bad torpedo crew. And they each gave these crews a torpedo. 2 of the 3 crews succeeded in successfully dropping this torpedo, so it would have been shallow enough to achieve its goal in Pearl Harbor of staying within 40 feet. So what's really interesting is when you see a show about Pearl Harbor, usually on TV, they will talk about this tail fin, which actually had been developed in 1936. The real answer was these anti-roll stabilizer fins that were achieved to keep that torpedo shallow. It was really, really an excellent innovation and was extremely effective. All right, the other key aspect of Japanese aircraft that were used at Pearl Harbor is this puppy named the Val. By the way, all Japanese aircraft were named by the U.S. If it was a bomber, it was named after a woman. If it was a fighter, it was named after a man. So Val is not a Japanese term. Probably figure that out. But it looks obsolete because it's got fixed landing gear, but it's a surprisingly effective dive bomber. So unlike a level bomber, what this plane was designed to do was to come down on a steep angle at its target, drop its bomb much more accurately, and then peel up. So it would, like that, right? And then that bomb would have a much better chance of hitting its target. So this is a dive bomber. It's a fast for its, again, it's underpowered, but it's relatively fast. It's highly maneuverable. It's difficult to shoot down because it's always twisting and turning. It didn't carry a particularly large bomb load. One 551-pound bomb and 232-pound general purpose bombs under the wings. But it's incredibly stable. The crews are the best in the world. And the Val actually sinks more Allied warships than any other aircraft in World War II, including the Stuka, the Ju-88, you name it. This was the #1 killer of warships in World War II, of Allied warships. All right, another aspect of the attack on Pearl Harbor is the midget submarine. It's considered a secret weapon by the Japanese. They carry it to Well, originally it was designed to be an ocean-going weapon. It was to be used to destroy the U.S. battle fleet. And it has about I'd say, I can't remember off the top of my head, maybe about a 80, 90 mile an hour range. But it does not have the capability to recharge its batteries. So once it runs out of power, the crew has to be rescued, basically. But it was designed, again, to be used in mid-ocean to destroy U.S. battleships. So it would be dropped off by submarines or by surface ships also, and basically sneak up on us while we were chasing the Japanese. And it would basically, a mobile minefield would probably be the way to look at it. They launched 5 from 10 miles off of Oahu. All of them were destroyed. One of them actually beached, and one of the crew members was overcome by noxious fumes and was actually captured and became prisoner number 1 of World War II for the United States. The problem with using this weapon was it could have tipped the Japanese off to the fact that we were, or that they were attacking Pearl Harbor, because this takes place, as we'll see, well before. This one is the submarine that was actually sunk by the USS Ward. It is at the bottom of the ocean. But at 3:42 a.m., well before the attack, we're already starting to see that there's Japanese submarines coming into the Pearl Harbor zone. The Ward is contacted. It doesn't find the sub. Later, the Ward sees a conning tower following a target ship. The target ship, there's a anti-submarine nets that lead into Pearl Harbor. And the nets are opened to let this target ship in. And this Japanese submarine is following it into Pearl Harbor. And the Ward obviously sees this thing and fires on it, scores a direct hit with a 4-inch gun, and reports to the Pearl Harbor superiors, hey, you know, we just sank a submarine. Unfortunately, they don't really do anything about it. And the U.S. does fire the first shot in World War II, naval shot. They actually, you actually can see the gun that sank this submarine. It's at the Minneapolis State House in Minnesota. It is available to be viewed. But this is 77 minutes before the air attack, and the Navy doesn't do anything. Absolutely nothing is done by the United States Navy to hey, you know, there's the Japanese stuff. You think you would do something, but nope. Now, what about Kido Butai? Kido Butai has decided to come in extremely from the north, way outside the shipping lanes. You can see the track here. That's the track in, that's the track out. So basically they're way above the shipping lanes. They can't be, they're not spotted. They're under radio blackout, so they're not broadcasting anything. And they come in completely underneath or from above, but the U.S. defenses actually are down here, where you see the Lexington's track. You see, and this is good for us because the Lexington and is not in port, you know, so Enterprise, I believe, is also on that track. So they were out delivering aircraft. So they're not in Pearl Harbor. Our aircraft carriers are not in Pearl Harbor when the attack occurs. All right, a couple other warnings were available. The radar is brand new. We see it's kind of a primitive looking thing by today's standards, but that's what they use for radar. And the general in charge, General Short, who's actually in charge of air defense, the Army is in charge of air defense for the Hawaiian Islands, not the Navy. And he basically doesn't think much of radar. He doesn't, what's this newfangled radar thing? And we'll just run it 4 hours a day and they can play with it and see if it works or not. But what happens then on the morning of December 7th, there's 2 privates that are running this radar station. And they decide, well, you know what, we could use some extra practice. Let's hang around and we'll play with it for a while. And lo and behold, coming from the north, they see a large formation of aircraft, the largest they've ever seen. And they're going, what the heck is this? So they call in to this Lieutenant Tyler. And Lieutenant Tyler is only been on the job for a week. He doesn't really want the job because he's a pilot and doesn't really want to be sitting here, dealing with radar. And he tells them, don't worry about it, it's no problem. It's a bunch of, he doesn't tell them this, but he thinks it's a bunch of B-17s that are flying in from the mainland, which actually are flying in pretty much exactly at the same time. So once again, Pearl Harbor has an opportunity to be warned of this incoming invasion or incoming attack, and once again they're not. Nothing happens. So now we'll talk about the actual air attack. And what we have here is our first wave attack, and that would be that one. And the first wave is 183 aircraft. Again, the Japanese are the only country in the world that has the capability of putting 183 aircraft into one attack from aircraft carriers. First group is to target battleships and aircraft carriers, and that includes 49 of the Kates, the torpedo and level bomber, and they are armed with those big, heavy, 1,760-pound artillery shell bombs. Then we have 40 Kates that are coming in that are armed with the Type 91 torpedo. Our second group, which is composed of course, the VALs, is to take out our airfields. And they all have general-purpose bombs, that explode on contact, not armor-piercing. And then the third group is Zero fighters, and some of you World War II military history aficionados are going, well, gee, Frank, why didn't you talk about the Zero? Well, you know what? We'll talk about the Zero when it's more pertinent in another class, because it's not that pertinent to this one. But they go ahead and they strafe the fields because there's no opposition in the air for them to deal with. So that is the first wave attack plan, and the first wave occurs. So the Japanese arrive over Oahu, over Pearl Harbor, at 6:53 a.m., and Fuchida, who is the air group commander, more about him later, he gives out the famous call, Tora, 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 which means tiger, 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 via radio that tells the Japanese fleet that they've achieved complete surprise. He then fires a flare because not all the Japanese aircraft are equipped with radios. And the flare is to signal that this attack has achieved complete surprise. So he fires a flare. He thinks that, wait a minute, not everybody's seen this thing. So he fires another flare. Bad idea, because 2 flares means that they have not achieved complete surprise, and he causes some chaos within his air groups, because now the torpedo bombers and the level bombers are going to attack simultaneously. This is not their original plan. So, he got a problem on his hands, but they still have a complete surprise, and they don't achieve optimal bombing results. And the second and third groups, though, they attack as planned. That's the VALs and the Zeros. And they achieve, of course, complete surprise and destroy U.S. aircraft on the fields. So, if we look at this picture, here we have the Kate torpedo bombers coming in to attack Battleship Row. And this would be Battleship Row. If you notice, for example, right there, the Battleship California has already been hit by a torpedo. It's leaking oil. The Colorado, large patch of oil, leaking oil from the West Virginia. So this picture was taken after numerous hits have already been made. The lead pilots, I told you these people were highly motivated. They were intending to literally crash into the torpedo nets if they encountered torpedo nets in order to knock them out of place so other torpedo bombers could score hits. So basically, even at this time of the war, they were willing to achieve something to the effect of kamikaze attacks. The torpedo attack is extremely successful. It is the most successful single aspect of the battle. They drop 40 torpedoes. They get 18 hits, 14 on battleships and 4 on other ships. So this is incredibly effective. Also, does this picture reveal a conning tower of a midget submarine? There's been significant research on this, and unfortunately I don't have a good enough picture of this, but right there, it appears that a Japanese midget submarine has just launched torpedoes, and because it's lighter, it broaches the surface. So consequently, and they've done a lot of research, 19 angles on it. They built a model of a Japanese submarine and put it out there and floated it. And there's a pretty good evidence that that actually is the conning tower of a Japanese midget submarine that managed to get all the way into Pearl Harbor and launch torpedoes. So, what's this really look like? Here's a Japanese torpedo bomber. There's a Japanese torpedo bomber. There was a giant explosion from the battleship West Virginia. So you can see the West Virginia has taken a direct hit. The target ship, Utah, which is an old battleship, you can see it's already starting to heel over. It will, in fact, roll over. And the cruiser Raleigh in this picture has already been hit, and it's beginning to sink as well. So this picture really reveals a lot of stuff. So if you know, when you really sit there and analyze some of these photos the Japanese took, there's a lot of information in there that most people don't really see. All right, this is the picture of the Japanese level bombers. And I'll tell you what, I think my lovely and talented class coordinator is telling me you all deserve a break. So we'll come back at this picture. Don't be tardy. So how's it going, boss?
General Short.
Sorry?
The General Short, he was the one that did not interested in the radar.
He didn't like radar.
You are doing a splendid job. Sorry? You are doing such a great job. I'm going to give you a good evaluation. As introduced. You introduced him so well. The man, the man.
Gentlemen.
I spent 2 years on Fort Island.
Did you?
I was in the Navy. Yeah. In fact, I was there for the 20th anniversary.
Oh, wow, that's a while ago.
Also the dedication of the memorial.
Yeah. You know, Elvis had a lot to do with that.
Yes, he did. And a lady actress, I forgot her name, but Elvis was involved in it.
Yeah.
He raised a lot of money.
Raised a lot of money, yeah.
So did the lady. I forgot her name.
Yeah, it's broken right now.
I saw her. Is it going to be taken down? Or?
How many minutes do they have off?
8.
8?
I heard something about that. Is it going to be?
They're going to repair it, but really what they're trying to, they don't know what to do with the Arizona.
I know it's still leaking oil.
It's going to leak a lot more. It's going to leak a lot more oil.
All that metal down there is rusting more.
Well, they filled it right before that Saturday. They filled it with fuel.
It's full.
It's full, and a lot of those fuel tanks never caught on fire, right? So there's actually thoughts about building a cofferdam around it.
Did you mute yourself or they mute you?
I don't know. Am I on? All right, everybody back to work.
See, they'll have fun as long as you allow them.
Well, I'm not allowing anything. I'll put you in charge.
Yeah. Yeah. Come on.
All right, welcome back. So, this picture was actually, again, taken by the Japanese. And this is the battleship row. And the level bombers, which we talked about, the Kates, are carrying that big old heavy 1,760-pound X artillery shell. And they're about to drop 49 of those on these sitting targets. Okay? But again, that level bombing thing has been thrown out of sync a little bit because they basically have rushed the attack because they were expecting to have more time while the torpedo bombers went in to organize themselves. They fly in like Vs, 5-plane Vs, and they drop, when the lead bomber drops a bomb, the other guys drop with him, okay? Which actually was a typical technique for U.S. and in the European theater too with B-17s, but regardless, that's how they run this thing, but they're disorganized. So, this attack is actually probably the least successful of any of the attacks they do. They drop 49 bombs. They only score 8 hits. 2 of those bombs broke up on impact. 2 had minor detonation. 1 was complete dud. 2 operated properly and didn't cause fatal damage, and 1 actually destroyed the USS Arizona. Of the 2 that did not detonate properly, I think it's kind of interesting that 1 went through the top of a turret on the main gun turret on the Maryland, battleship Maryland, and lands in the middle of this turret. There's men inside the turret, and this thing crashes through the roof, and it's sitting there and starts emitting smoke. And these people in the gun turret, the ones that survived, think that the Japanese have actually dropped poison gas. Okay? So they like run out of the turret because they're, it's like, whoa. So not a particularly well-designed or useful bomb, but it did have one very successful thing, and that is the destruction of the Arizona. The Arizona is only hit by 2 bombs. 1 bomb deflects off the side of a turret and crashes into the side of the ship and does very minimal damage. The other bomb penetrates near, they believe, they're not sure, near the forward magazine where their powder is stored. Now the thought process is that they had some improperly stored black powder, perhaps for their saluting cannon. And cordite doesn't really explode very easily. So what you do to set cordite off in a gun shell, they have these bags of cordite, is they put a little black powder patch on the back of them. So it's possible that that happened as well. But the entire forward cordite magazine of the Arizona blows up. And the picture you're seeing in color was actually taken in color. The gentleman that took this picture was a Navy doctor on a hospital ship that was stationed nearby called the Solace. And the Solace, he was taking pictures with his camera when the Japanese happened to attack. And he took these color photos of the Arizona exploding. And it was thought that the smoke coming up through the smokestack, that a bomb had gone through the smokestack. That is not true. That is just the explosion was so large of that cordite magazine of powder going up that it literally blew the dirt out of the boiler system of the Arizona. So that's what that big smokestack is. And that's the actual bomb. Again, not a very good bomb. Of its 1,760 pounds, it only had 49 pounds of explosive, and the explosive they used was relatively ineffective. So you could say that the Arizona had a lot of bad luck that day, but that's pretty much what happened. All right, remember I told you about those Vals and those Zeros strafing and bombing? Well, they did a fine job. That's the remains of the P-40s on Hickam Field. You can see they're not in very good shape. They dropped their 550-pound general-purpose bombs. The Zeros were not facing any opposition from Allied fighters. No Allied fighters were off the ground at this point. And the fighters were parked wingtip to wingtip because General Short felt that the biggest threat to Hawaii was not an air attack, but was by sabotage by the local Japanese population. So he stacked all his planes up wingtip to wingtip so they could be better guarded by the local, by the military at the air bases. So, needless to say, they became really easy targets. And the first wave virtually destroys air power on Hawaii. Okay, let's look at the second wave. The second wave comes in from here approximately an hour later. It consists of another 171 aircraft. I can't stress this enough. No Navy was capable of doing that, of putting 171 planes in off of carriers, except the Japanese. They have 54 Kates. They got 81 of the Vals, and they've got 36 escorting Zeros. They're armed. This is interesting now. They are armed, the Kates, with, most of the Kates are armed with one 550-pound bomb and 632-pound bombs, 3 under each wing. Some of the Kates are armed with two 550s, and the way we know that is there's pictures of it, because they were all supposed to be armed with this combination of one 550 and 6 132s. But some apparently were armed differently, even though that was not what the plan called for. And they are to attack, 27 of them are to attack one group of airfields. 27 are to attack Hickam Field, which is right by Pearl Harbor. And the second group is to attack, that's the Vals, are to attack the aircraft carriers and the cruisers. Because they only have a 550-pound bomb, these bombs are viewed not to be effective against battleships. So they are now going to hunt for aircraft carriers and cruisers. Of course, there are no aircraft carriers there. The third group, again, the Zeros, there's minimal opposition now. There are some fighters in the air, U.S. fighters, and the Zeros still are pretty much free to attack with strafing runs. And there's 35 of those. One does not make it. One aborts. You notice the first one was 36. He aborted his flight. Sorry I had to use the same picture again. I just really liked it. So the Kates come in and they attack the airfields again. And they are there to finish the job that the first wave valve didn't do. The Zeros are again to protect the bombers, which they do and then strafe. And again, like I said, some Army fighters do get in the air and cause some damage to the Japanese, not very much. All right, what about those Vals? Okay, they're armed with the 550s, and they're going after ships. And they see the Nevada sailing out of Pearl Harbor. Even though it's been hit by a torpedo, the captain of the Nevada had steam up and was trying to get the ship out into the ocean. Well, they swarm this thing like a bunch of bees. They're not happy about this. So a bunch of valves hit the Nevada a minimum of 6 times. Some people think 8. It's one of those debates. And basically what that happens is the Nevada has to be beached before it sinks into the middle of the harbor, which would block the harbor. So the captain of the Nevada basically just crashes the ship onto the land to keep it from sinking. The second wave valves do destroy 3 destroyers. They have a couple hits on the California. They hit the Pennsylvania. but they don't really do any serious damage to any of these ships, nothing that would cause them to be lost. So let's look at Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack. From this view, we see Battleship Row. This is where the torpedo planes would have come in. Torpedo planes also came in from this side by accident, because that's where the carriers used to sit. And since the carriers weren't there, they torpedoed the Utah and the cruiser Raleigh. And they also torpedoed the California. So that's where your torpedo planes were to come in, from those two spots. But the Japanese have now left. So what did they achieve here? They sank the Arizona, the West Virginia, the Oklahoma, the California. The Nevada is beached. The Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Maryland are all damaged. Utah, which is a useless thing really, it's a target ship, is sunk. The little Ogallala, I never could pronounce that one. You tell me what O-G-L-A-L-A means, how to say that, and we'll all know. But the destroyer caissons, Downs, and Shaw are destroyed, and of course the numerous cruisers are damaged. The Vestal, which was a repair ship, was next to the Arizona. When the Arizona exploded, it did so much damage to the Vestal that the Vestal sank, but it was fortunately beached before it could sink. There's 402 U.S. aircraft in Pearl Harbor. 188 are destroyed on the ground, and 159 are damaged, so U.S. air power is pretty much wiped out. And sadly, 2,403 Americans are killed, 1,178 are wounded, and none of these people are combatants. War was not declared. They are all non-combatants. So in effect, legally, what the Japanese did was commit murder. Needless to say, the U.S. population, I'm sure you're all well aware, was enraged by this attack. Because, again, no war was declared. These people are not, these are non-combatants that were killed. All right, what did the Japanese lose? There's a Kate that was pulled out of the water. Their losses are very light. 350 aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. 9 in the first wave were shot down. 20 in the second wave were shot down, for a total loss of 55 aircrew. They also lost the 5 midget submarines, 9 killed, 1 captured. But what's not well known is the Navy, primarily, put a pretty good anti-aircraft fire, considering they were caught flat-footed, and 74 of the 350, well, not 350, but 74 of their losses, of their, plus the 29 losses, another 74 are damaged. So those aircraft are really not, many of them are not capable of attempting the third strike, which is always a major debate on this thing. And that debate is mainly caused by this gentleman, Mitsuo Fuchida, who after the war wrote several books and claimed that he begged Admiral Nagumo, who was in charge of Kido Butai, to launch a third strike. And Commander Genda, who was also there, kind of jumped on board this whole thing too. And realistically, Japanese historians don't believe this. They think that this is totally ridiculous, that these guys did not go to Nagumo and plead for a third strike, because no third strike was ever even planned. It's driven again by his post-war writings, and it doesn't really match the reality of the military situation. So let's look at that. The attack was meant to be a raid. It was to be 2 forces. That's all it was ever to be. The Japanese doctrine was totally to attack warships, not infrastructure. They claimed on this is that the third strike was designed to attack the infrastructure of Pearl Harbor. That was never a Japanese doctrine. Again, 74 aircraft were damaged. By the time they could have reorganized a third strike, launched it, it would have gotten to Pearl Harbor and come back. It would have been dark. The Japanese did not have capability to recover aircraft or to do night carrier operations. So again, Japanese historians don't buy it, and quite honestly, when you really look at the facts, probably this never really occurred, but it made for good Hollywood again. So, but it made Fuchida look good, made it look really smart. So, what if the Japanese had thought about infrastructure? So the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is an unmitigated failure. What they have sunk and damaged is basically a fleet of old, relatively useless battleships. They are slow, they use a ton of fuel, and realistically they had no effect on the outcome of the war in the Pacific. The only use these ships really ever have is because they're too slow to keep up with the aircraft carriers. They only go 20 knots. That's all they're capable of. Aircraft carriers are going 32 knots. Aircraft carriers are fast and nimble. These things are not. So they've destroyed basically a valueless target. All they ever really are used for is to bombard shore islands and shore defenses. That's all they're ever for. So they have no control. What they could have done instead, though, if we look at this picture, we see fuel tanks, fuel tanks, fuel tanks. There's a tremendous amount of stored fuel. The entire storage of fuel in the entire Pacific region for the United States Navy is stored here. So let's just assume, let's be a little counterfactual today, that 27 of those Kates that hit in the second wave that attacked the airfields had decided instead to attack those oil tanks. They would have been capable, 27 aircraft would have been capable of dropping 189 bombs on those fuel tanks. 189 bombs on those fuel tanks, and even the little 132 pounders can do a heck of a lot of damage to a tank of oil. Trust me on that. So you would have been able to cause giant conflagration of fires from attacking that fuel. Now, the U.S. doesn't really have the capability to replace that fuel anytime soon or to repair the facility. So consequently, had they done that, had they attacked the fuel, they would have knocked Pearl Harbor out as a base for 6 months to a year, and would have been vastly more effective than sinking those old, slow battleships. And that's only with 20% of their attack force. Let's say they'd used the bulk of their attack force of the second wave. They could have attacked all those oil tanks thoroughly. They could have attacked the Navy repair yard and destroyed that. And they could have attacked the sub-base. All these would have been vastly more valuable targets than what they did do. But Japanese doctrine is not to attack shore installations, it's to attack warships. And doctrine is always key in these things. All right, let's talk about this guy, Edwin T. Layton. He later becomes an admiral. And I should have on my syllabus, and I recommend some books. I didn't recommend his book, which he wrote right before he died. In fact, didn't actually finish it. And it's called I Was There. And I Was There by Admiral Edwin T. Layton. And he is one of the most important people, I think, and another gentleman named Joe Rochefort. There's a book out called Joe Rochefort's War. These were the people that developed our ability to break Japanese codes and use that information properly. But anyway, Edwin Layton, people say, well, why didn't we were breaking the Japanese codes, why didn't we know about Pearl Harbor? Well, we could read their diplomatic code, which is called Purple in our terminology, and the Purple Code, but it's diplomatic. It's not a military code. It's what they sent to their ambassadors. So the military code, which is JN25, we're not really breaking that very much. A very small percentage of that is readable. So that's kind of a problem. The other thing is the majority of intelligence at this time was done in two methodologies. You would use radio direction finding, RDF, so if you were on the ocean and you broadcast a radio signal, you could triangulate that signal and know where that ship was. The other thing is that they would be punching code in, like Morse code, and people had what they would refer to as a fist. Like you can, if you were familiar with me and you heard my voice, without seeing me, you would know it was me or someone imitating me. But the fact of the matter is, people that are doing code have that same capability. You can understand, you will know who a person is by the way he punches code, and that's called a fist. So they can track individual warships by their individual person that does their code. And the Japanese, unfortunately for us, did an excellent job of disguising all of this. They blacked out all their radio communications. They basically forged some of the people that did radio signals and left them in Japan, so we would think the ships were still in Japan. And they did a really good job of it. And Admiral Kimmel, who's in charge of Pearl Harbor, the Navy side, goes to Leighton, he goes, "Where are the Jap carriers?" This is before the Pearl Harbor thing. And Leighton goes, "I don't know. I think they might be in port." And Kimmel goes, "You mean they could be rounding Diamond Head and you would not know it?" And Leighton has nothing to say to that. He has nothing to say, but I don't know where they are. They've disappeared. And unfortunately, we know where they are now. Then we have this gentleman, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, another famous, particularly later in the war, but he's in charge of Washington's intelligence group. Turner makes the decision to deny the diplomatic codes to Admiral Kimmel because he doesn't want to disseminate too much information, because again, with secrets, the more people that know a secret, the easier it is to find out what's going on. And he thinks that, they don't need this information. The Pacific Fleet argues that they would have been in a much better state of readiness had they had this information. Another key part of this information is the famous bomb plot. The bomb plot, the Japanese diplomatic code sent a message to the consulate in Hawaii saying, "Hey, you know what we'd like you to do is we would like you guys to make a grid of Pearl Harbor and kind of tell us like what ships normally go here and what things kind of normally go there, and make a grid of it," okay? This is again used as an argument that had that been told to Pearl Harbor, they would have thought that the Japanese had much more intention of attacking Pearl Harbor, because that would in effect be, in quotes, the bomb plot, a plan to bomb Pearl Harbor. Turner also denies sending the famous 14-part message. The Japanese are planning to they have a mission into Washington, and they're negotiating, what's going to happen, hopefully to prevent the war. And then the Japanese decide to send this famous 14-part message, and they send 13 parts, and the last part is sent the morning of Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese don't decode it in time and go into Cordell Hull's office and say, "Hey, here's the last part of the message." And of course, they've already bombed Pearl Harbor, and Cordell Hull, needless to say, is less than happy with them. They deny giving them this information. Again, Pearl Harbor feels, the leadership of Pearl Harbor feel they should have been given this information, that they could have had more warning of perhaps, but again, it doesn't really, first of all, the 14-part message, believe it or not, doesn't declare war on the United States. It just says we're breaking off diplomatic negotiations. So even though it was meant to say, hey, we're breaking off diplomatic negotiations, it was timed so that 1 hour later they would bomb Pearl Harbor without declaring war either way. So they weren't going to declare war, but it was, so this is kind of like, so if you tell Kimmel in short, hey, the Japanese are breaking off diplomatic negotiations at that particular time, you might have been able to look at it and say, well, why would they do it at that time? And look at what that time would be in relationship to Hawaii and say, that's interesting. That's 8 a.m. Sunday morning in Hawaii. That's a big leap, okay, from just this kind of intelligence, I think. So Again, I'm not so sure about that, but again, if you ever see the movie Tora, 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 they're going to make a real big deal about this, okay? So, and so that denial of information becomes the defense of Admiral Kimmel and General Short in relationship to what happens to them later on. And then, so why is Pearl Harbor a surprise attack? The focus for a possible war in the Pacific is on the Philippines, it's on Malaysia, and it's so much so that Admiral Turner decides to give the purple code to General MacArthur. Hawaii doesn't need this, but I bet they're going to attack the Philippines, so I bet they need this a lot more. So he sends those scripts to MacArthur in the Philippines. The U.S. is well aware that Pearl Harbor is vulnerable. There's been numerous war games that have been played where a single, now again, nothing like what Kido Butai is capable of, but a single Japanese, or pretending to be a Japanese carrier, a single U.S. carrier launches a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. This has been done, I believe, 3 times. 2 for sure, I can remember. But, so it's not like the U.S. has never thought about the fact that the Japanese might attack Pearl Harbor using an aircraft carrier. The other issue is the U.S. feels, or the commander, particularly General Short, feels he doesn't have enough air assets to maintain, and it's probably a pretty good argument, really, that he doesn't have enough air assets to launch a 360-degree search on an everyday basis. Again, this would take a lot of aircraft because you're flying these planes basically 24/7 out searching out to a radius of 700 miles around Pearl Harbor. So consequently, it would take a lot of planes and a lot of pilots to maintain that kind of an air search 360 degrees. So what they in fact do is the Japanese have mandated islands that are southwest of Pearl Harbor. They take their search and make sure that that area is thoroughly covered, but they cannot therefore cover 360 degrees. So when the Japanese come from the north, they're not spotted because they come from a direction that we did not expect. So, another thing that throws people off the scent is there's a large fleet, a large invasion fleet, is spotted heading from Vietnam towards the Kra Isthmus in Malaysia. And again, the U.S. and the British assume that the Japanese attack is going to be there. It's not going to be in the Central Pacific. It's certainly not going to be at Pearl Harbor. It's going to be at Malaysia, which is obviously much closer, and really what they want anyway. So, once again, this throws us off the scent that perhaps Pearl Harbor is in danger, because we know this fleet has been spotted. And by the way, the gentlemen that spotted the fleet are actually shot down by Japanese planes and actually become the first British casualties of World War II in the Pacific. So, what does this tell us? Belief in what an enemy will do rather than what they are capable of is the classic military mistake. By disregarding what could be done by an enemy, and rather thinking, well, this is what they're going to do, they're going to attack Malaysia, perhaps they're going to attack the Philippines, that puts Pearl Harbor in a relatively unprepared state. And quite honestly, I think pretty much the United States was in an unprepared state. So let's talk about Kimmel and Short for just a minute. So they were given a war warning. They were told that war is imminent on November 27th, more than a week before Pearl Harbor. But the Pacific Fleet and the U.S. Army are not prepared for this, guys are out on shore leave. It's Saturday night in Pearl Harbor. We're all having a party. We're all drinking. We're at the local dance. If you got a war warning, I don't necessarily think this is the behavior that should have occurred. Also, General Short, and I think he's probably even much more culpable than Kimmel, because he was in charge of air defense. All their ammunition for their anti-aircraft guns, there's 31 batteries of anti-aircraft guns, only 4 of them get into the fight because their ammunition is locked up. Again, our planes are on the bases stacked wingtip to wingtip as perfect targets. So I don't think this is the mental process that probably should have been going on if I was given a war warning, unless I was so confident that nothing was going to happen at Pearl Harbor. So I think Kimmel and Short really need to share some blame. I know a lot of people, yes? Oh, no. He was in charge of the Pacific Fleet. He was the admiral in charge of the entire Pacific Fleet. Leighton, the intelligence officer, reported to him. Leighton then later on reported to Nimitz. But no, he was not. He was in charge of the entire Pacific Fleet. He was realistically, as far as the Navy goes, he was probably like equivalent to like the number 2 or 3 guy in the Navy. So he's a big player. Okay. Well, again, I've stressed this over and over again, but I think the entire United States military was not mentally prepared to fight World War II on December 7th of 1941. I do think the Japanese were prepared because, again, they had numerous combat veterans. They'd been at war for 4 years almost. And they were ready to fight, and they were much better trained, and their training was vastly more realistic. They would have night fleet maneuvers, and they would take, casualties, and they didn't care. They were willing to put things on the line to be as best trained and as good as they could possibly be, and they were 100% ready on all levels for their confrontation with the United States, as far as they were concerned. Of course, as we know, they weren't. I'm sorry? Oh, their fuel problem? Well, they intended to get that fuel from Southeast Asia. They were going to take it from Brunei. That's kind of another aspect of this. We have a lot of capability, but they have limited shipping. When they start the war, they have very limited shipping. They only have basically enough to get by. I believe it's about 6 million tons. That seems like a lot, but it's really not for an island nation. So anyway, much has been written about FDR allowed the attack to occur. And there's tons of books out there that say, that this was a conspiracy and this was a plot and that FDR let them attack Pearl Harbor and we had all this intelligence information and yada yada. There's not been one legitimate historian that has ever been able to find a bit of proof of that. 0. So FDR certainly would not have allowed the U.S. fleet to be destroyed at Pearl Harbor just to get us into the war. That is insanity. There are a lot of other ways you could have found a way to get us into the war than doing that. And you got to remember that FDR loved the Navy. He was a former assistant secretary of the Navy. He used to collect model warships. The last thing in the world FDR would have ever done would have been allowed for the Pacific Fleet to be destroyed at anchor in Pearl Harbor. And folks, I'm now open for questions. Yes, sir. Never thought about it. It was not their doctrine. Their doctrine was if you destroy all the warships, you automatically, everything else falls. Of course, destroying all the warships isn't necessarily easy, but it would have been a lot easier to hit that sitting duck target. It would have bought them a year, maybe 6 months to a year. So, yes, sir. They had new ones coming. A lot of them. No, there were, surprisingly, the battle fleet was restored relatively quickly. By early spring, they had a reasonable fleet back available. Remember, Maryland was lightly damaged. Pennsylvania was lightly damaged. I can't think of the other one. But they had 3 or 4 that were available relatively quickly. Yes?
You mentioned that the battleship's main function in World War II was, shore bombardment.
Those battleships.
Wasn't Nevada used as D-Day after it was refloated?
Yes, it was shore bombardment, yes. Yeah. And the Texas was there too, even though the Texas wasn't in Pearl Harbor. Yes, sir?
Were any ranking officers of either the Navy or the Army fired?
Yes, both Kimmel and Short. There you go. Oh, no, he was not. No, he had a fine war career as an alcoholic, but other than that. Yes, one more. I'll take one more. I got to go.
I recently read, and most recently saw, read a bit about Billy Mitchell. Just last night, in anticipation of this presentation today, I watched the movie with Gary Cooper, the trial of Billy Mitchell. Hollywood said that, in their script, said that he predicted in 1925, in his trial, that the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor. Is that
I wouldn't necessarily vouch for that, but again, the Japanese, there's numerous fiction books that were written about attacks on Pearl Harbor well before the event. Like I said, we did war games on it. It certainly wasn't out of the realm of possibility. Another thing Billy Mitchell did predict, though, was that it would be easy to firebomb the paper cities of Japan. He was certainly right about that.
How many carriers do we have in the Pacific, and how was it that 2 of them were out delivering planes?
You mean right now?
No.
Yeah, at this Pearl Harbor. Yes, 2 of them were out delivering planes. One was taking planes to Wake Island, which we will talk about next week. The other one was taking planes to Midway Island, which we will talk about 2 weeks after that. And the other one was in California, which was the Saratoga. We had 3 available fleet carriers in the Pacific. Well, thank you so much for coming. I hope to see you all next week.